The American-Russian Crisis. Bible Insights. What is the rivalry between Russia and the United States? The rivalry between Russia and the United States dates back almost to the beginning of the communist Russia. In 1918, after the Bolshevik Revolution, President Woodrow Wilson ordered 8,500 American troops into Siberia to help the Russians fight the Russian Bolsheviks. The American embassy in Russia was closed in 1919 and there was no diplomatic relations made for the next 14 years. However, the strained relation between Russia and America was set aside very briefly during World War II with the threat of Nazi Germany. Following World War II, the US emerged as one of the two dominant world superpowers, Russia the other superpower. In 1949, the US formed the NATO alliance, and in 1955, Russia formed the Warsaw Pact of Soviet communist states. Both superpowers began to develop and possess the world's largest nuclear weapons, followed by proxy wars, most famously in Korea and Vietnam, not to mention the space race. All this and more formed the rivalry between Russia and the United States, known as the Cold War. In the 1980s, the US, with the help of the Pope, combined forces to bring down the Soviet Empire that had been assembled by Russia. The rivalry continued in 1989 with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and certainly by 1991 the USSR was at its end. But America had not fully dealt with the Russian power, and so the rivalry was far from over. Does the Bible say anything about the rivalry between these two superpowers? Yes. Although neither country is identified by name in the Bible, there are symbols that identify both Russia and America in Bible prophecy. The most detailed description, which reveals by shadow and by direct fulfillment the rivalry between the two superpowers, are found in the book of Daniel, chapter 11. Here is described in type and antitype a struggle between two superpowers of the world, one the king of the south and the other the king of the north. Are we seeing the rivalry of the king of the south and the king of the north today? Well, let's begin with the king of the south. The first king of the south is mentioned in Daniel chapter 11 verse 5. This was Ptolemy Soter, who ruled over Egypt. The nation of Egypt is most notably remembered in the Bible for Pharaoh's response to Moses, "Who is God?" This marks the essence of atheism. The rise of Ptolemy to power came amidst a civil war and revolution after the death of Alexander the Great. One of the first things he did was to move the nation's capital from Memphis to Alexandria. He was also described as strong, or in other words, the second strongest superpower in the world at the time. In the 18th century, another superpower of the world bore a striking similarity to Egypt, just mentioned. This time it was France. It too came about amidst a civil war called the French Revolution. Like Egypt, France now denied God's existence by its laws, its leaders, and its actions. In 1789, the French revolutionists moved the capital from Versailles to Paris, and under Napoleon, France was one of the strongest superpowers militarily and economically in its time. In the 20th century, one more superpower took the stage of action, replacing France and establishing itself as the new king of the South. This time, it was Russia. Just like the other two nations, communist Russia came about amidst a civil war called the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Russia formed the USSR in 1922 and issued the Bezbuznik magazine, or in other words, the Godless magazine. By 1934, they closed down 28% of the churches, 42% of the mosques, 52% of Jewish synagogues. Proselyting or evangelizing was largely forbidden. Its communist principles were rooted in the philosophy of Karl Marx, who is God, or atheism. Is Russia found anywhere else in the prophetic books of Daniel or Revelation? Formerly called the Huns, Russia is described in Daniel 7 as one of the 7 horns of Europe. And in Revelation 8 verse 10 and 11, the Huns had a great warlike ability that could create consequences to its enemies that were as bitter as wormwood. The Huns under Attila became the most powerful and most feared military force in Europe. Russia remains the single most powerful military force in Europe and is today the king of the south of Daniel 11. What previous events between Russia and the United States does the Bible already foretell? In Daniel 11 verse 40, the Bible describes how in the last days, the king of the north, that is the United States of America, together with the Pope, would bring down the union of countries banded together under the Russian Soviet Empire, or the USSR. And using economic and military pressure, ships and chariots, America would bring about the collapse of the USSR. This was fulfilled in 1989 to 1991 with the united effort of Pope John Paul II, Ronald Reagan and Bush Sr. However, although the countries of the USSR were dissolved, Russia, the source and the founder of the USSR, remained intact. Therefore, the rivalry between these two superpowers, Russia and America, is spoken of in the Bible directly in Daniel 11 verse 40. Will this rivalry go away anytime soon? No, not really. Just as there was a long drawn out war between the Seleucid Empire of the north and the Ptolemaic Empire of the south in Daniel 11 verse 5 to 29, so in our time Russia and the United States rivalry from the time of the Russian Revolution until now will not go away anytime soon. In fact, shadows of their conflict are foretold in Daniel 11 verses 10 to 15. These two major battles suggest more direct conflicts between the two superpowers post-collapse of the Soviet Union and before the final agitations of Sunday sacredness.